Hey everybody, I'm Kevin Trainer. I'm a senior this year at Presbyterian College, and for my senior capstone, we looked at the Alfred Hitchcock film Psycho, and we looked at it with a new historicist and psychoanalytic lens in order to analyze Norman Bates, the film's principal villain. So Psycho, often considered Hitchcock's magnum opus, released in 1960. It depicts the runaway with $40,000, Marion Crane, trekking across the country when she stops one night at the eponymous Bates Motel, where she meets the hotel's sole proprietor, Norman Bates, who is innocent, if not lonely, at first, but then as the plot advances, we see how Norman transforms, and we see a darker side of Norman, or should I say two sides total. So in looking at the film, I wanted to look at how Norman and his behavior reflects various societal values and customs. This is the job of new historicist thought, which we look at how the 1950s time period the story takes place in may have influenced the events and behaviors of the characters themselves. When I looked at 1950s era society standards under this lens, I uncovered the ignorance of mental illness and how most of it was considered to be a blanket term just known as madness. And we see the rising popularity of Sigmund Freud's teachings and his psychoanalytic theory. And all of these things together influence the critical reception of the film in question. So, my thesis is, of course, Norman Bates' violent and unstable behavior stems from a deep-seated distrust of 1950s era mental institutions, and he operates under a heavy Oedipus complex as defined by Freud, which drives his every action, thereby creating a memorable and frightening antagonist that has not been seen before or after since. So if we take a look at the new historicism side of it first, we look at how, once again, we want to look at how literature is a product of its time. It grasps the pre-narrativized past, and in doing so, we look at the writings of Michel Foucault, a French theologian, who preached new historicism as chief among all literary discourses. And so when looking at works such as Psycho and many others, we often notice that society and the society in these works operates on power dynamics, where the wealthy elite, in most cases, determines what is okay and correct, and everything else is considered taboo. And this is a problem that is innate in society itself, and it will continue to find forbidden thoughts and actions over and over again in madness, as madness was a convenient scapegoat. Because of this, fear of the mentally ill rose, many stereotypes were created, and as a result of this, the mad were isolated in mental institutions that were very unsanitary and degrading. Off the record, some of them included whipping as a form of punishment, bondage to a wall as another form of reprimandation. Nobody was allowed to be escorted to the restroom. They were just expected to urinate and defecate on themselves. One particular inmate was strapped to a wall for 3 months, and it just continued to get worse and worse. So naturally, as a result, when we look at the film, Norman Bates, who harbors his own mental instabilities, is very obviously suspicious and distrusting of these institutions, but he's also hostile towards anybody that suggests them as a solution to an issue, and anybody who questions his motives in general. The first instance of this comes from an early scene where Marion first introduces herself to Norman Bates. They have a fairly amiable conversation, where Norman discusses how frustrating it is to care for his mother. When asking about what he should do, Marion suggests that he should put her someplace being a mental institution, which drives him up a wall, and suddenly Norman's polite, innocent persona switches into an angry and foreboding one. He leans forward in his chair and he says, "People always call a madhouse someplace, don't they?" And this trend of uncomfortable seeds in personality continue throughout the rest of the film. Another good instance of this comes to us from a later scene where a private investigator decides to look into the case of Marion's disappearance, as well as previous women that were suspiciously disappeared during that time period. Can't speak today. So, when being questioned, the private investigator grills Norman over and over, and when he suggests that Norman's inconclusive and contradictory stories are the result of him just being confused by somebody, Norman snaps back and says, "I'm not a fool, and I'm not capable of being fooled." demonstrating that, once again, he does not trust what these people are suggesting, and this heightens his violent actions throughout the rest of the film. The next example, I think, works better showing rather than telling. We see Sam, who's Marion's boyfriend, and Lila, her sister, decide to seek out Marion themselves under the guise of merely just checking into the hotel as a husband and wife couple. After a fairly awkward conversation, they depart to their room, intent on waiting until Norman lowers his guard, and they go take a trek up to the house that is ever suspicious to them. What's noteworthy here is the way Norman stares at them as they leave. This is Lila. Watch how Norman reacts as soon as they walk away. Pretty disturbing, if not suspicious in and of itself, and it very much demonstrates that Norman does not trust what these people claim to be their cover story is, and that he's going to keep an eye out on them throughout the rest of the film. So, moving back towards the presentation. By the end of the movie, Norman is eventually incarcerated and imprisoned, and during the final monologue, his mother persona, more on that in a little bit, elaborates that as a result of his actions, Norman will go straight back to these mental institutions that he fears so much. She surmises he was always bad and they'll take him away, pretty clearly demonstrating that's what lies for Norman next. Now, taking a turn towards psychoanalysis and Freud, we look at what led to Norman himself developing an Oedipus complex. Psychoanalytic theory in general seeks to look at the individual, look at the self, and analyze how their hidden wants, fears, desires influence their behavior that they have on the surface. And the belief being that no matter how hard one tries to suppress their true desires, eventually they come up anyway, often called a Freudian slip in popular culture. Sigmund Freud, in this theory, gained popularity as he was different from most psychologists in that he did not treat patients as a science experiment to be picked at and analyzed, but as human beings experiencing turmoil from their embattled mind, which was a pretty unique perspective and one that added a sense of humility to the study. And talking about the Oedipus complex, this is an extended reference to the Greek myth Oedipus Rex, wherein the titular character fulfills the unfortunate prophecy that he is to murder his father and marry his mother. Norman himself, as we will see shortly, performs a similar act that signifies his Oedipal desires, and he fulfills said prophecy in the end, but with a twist that we will see shortly. Again, looking at Norman, in terms of what he suppresses a lust for his mother, a hatred for her boyfriend, and a wish to withhold any and all information from anyone who questions him. His murders that he commits throughout the story are the result of preventing others from finding out the truth. As we looked at in previous studies, he retained a sexual love for his mother, and the things he suppressed were his sexuality, his aggression, and his first murders that happened prior to the film's events. When discussing the scene with the psychologist at the end of the film, in a move that's fairly strange in terms of narrative fiction, I'm not a big fan of this myself. In using this for a study, however, it was quite useful. We see as the psychiatrist, fully outlines everything that is going on in Norman's head as it happens and why he committed the acts he did. From a narrative standpoint, I usually prefer letting the audience figure things out for themselves. However, the psychologist here firmly outlines everything I have said thus far and echoes the exact conclusions I wish to make.
Well, now, look, if you're trying to lay some psychiatric groundwork for some sort of plea, this fellow like the cop, the psychiatrist doesn't lay the groundwork. He merely tries to explain it.
But my sister is...
Yes, I'm sorry. The private investigator, too. If you drag that swamp somewhere in the vicinity of the motel, you... Have you any unsolved missing persons cases?
Skip ahead slightly.
From the mother half of Norman's mind, you have to go back 10 years. To the time when Norman murdered his mother and Ella. Now, he was already dangerously disturbed. Had been ever since his father died.
So, as a result of him suppressing his feelings of jealousy and lust, Norman can contain his anger no longer, and in a fit of rage, murders not just the boyfriend character that acts as the father figure in terms of the Oedipus comparison, but he also murders his mother himself. And unable to cope with the guilt, he essentially absorbs her persona as part of his own subconscious, thereby operating under two different personas, his, Norman, and his mother, Norma, which he switches throughout most of the film. We see previous scenes where he argues with her in the house on the hill. That is actually Norman moving back and forth in the scene, imitating both his mother's voice and performing his own. Now, as a result of this, Norman himself was an antagonist that was unique as he was terrifying, not just to audiences that watched the movie upon its release, but critic opinion as well. What's interesting is that opinions in terms of the film's overall quality were varied across the board. Some considered it Hitchcock's finest work, others said it was the worst one he had done yet. However, all of them took time to mention that Norman was a strange fellow, that he had an abnormal love for his mother, and that he was mad, in keeping with the madness stereotypes. New York Times review calls him a queer duck given to smirks and giggles. Not the most flattering characterization of somebody who at that point in time was fairly innocent and friendly until we saw what he had committed later. The New York Daily News, he's a lonely young man with an abnormal love for his mother, thereby signifying that it's not just our analysis that picked up on the Oedipal connotations, but the critic opinion at the time as well. Hollywood Reporter, throughout most of the film, he maintains an appearance of innocence despite everything he acts on. And perhaps the most interesting review I came across, The Guardian, which was the most negative review of the film I have ever seen, both in critic opinion and audience opinion alike. They said off the record it depicted the most gruesome murder in all of cinema history, which I feel like would be a bar that would be continually raised year by year. However, they do take time to comment that Norman is a crazy, mad taxidermist. There's that word again, he's mad. He's not mentally ill, he's mad, thereby in keeping with the stereotypes of the time period. Because of this, the film gained cultural significance and would be regarded as a cult classic until it reached mainstream appeal upon further re-releases, signifying its place in American cinema history, with Norman Bates being perhaps the most psychologically driven, terrifying antagonist in cinema at that point in time. This concludes my presentation, and I thank you for your time.